How it's impacting their organization. She'll turn it over then to Jenny Gilmore Robinson with CARES Northwest. She'll talk about what they're seeing and the impacts they're feeling. And then lastly, she will turn it over to Washington County District Attorney Kevin Barton, and he can talk from their office's perspective about the impacts that they're feeling. Then it will go back to AG Rayfield. He can talk about the next legal steps, and then we will open it up for questions. So with that, I will turn it over to AG Rayfield.
Well, thank you for being here today. Today, Oregon was once again forced to file a lawsuit against the federal government, and this time to protect the victims of crime, survivors, and providers who do the important work helping vulnerable Oregonians in their time of need. The federal administration is trying to use victims of crime as a political tool to carry out an incredibly unpopular political agenda, and they're doing it in an unprecedented way by requiring the state to sign terms and conditions that ignore judicial precedent and long-standing Oregon laws, merely to receive our regular funding, effectively holding the funding for victims of crime and survivors captive. This means leaving women with nowhere to turn when they've been assaulted by their partner. That means no counseling, safety planning, or professional support. And this just isn't theoretical. We're already seeing the impacts of the federal government decisions here in Oregon. Last week, in Beaverton, a sexual assault resource center sent a notice of immediate emergency pause of all services due to this funding uncertainty. And there is absolutely no timeline for when they might be able to reopen. Funding cuts like this at the federal level mean that when the money stops, these critical services can and will disappear overnight, leaving survivors without the support of communities and without a safety net in our communities. And this lawsuit is about keeping shelters open for survivors of domestic violence who need a safe place to sleep at night, and making sure that we can keep the doors open of child advocacy centers throughout our state so that when something awful happens to a child, there are experts to provide safe services to get to the bottom of what happened and to provide counseling services to that child and those families in need. We need leaders at all levels of government to put aside their policy and political differences to work together on this universally supported issue, to restore funding and to stabilize these programs. The president is absolutely welcome to disagree with the state of Oregon on our policies and our laws, but holding funding hostage is not the way we resolve disagreements in the United States. I want to acknowledge that this lawsuit, like all others, is reactive to what is going on in Washington, D.C., and alone, it is going to take time to restore these important services. As a result, we as leaders of the state have an obligation to ask our state legislature to help step up and backfill these programs at a time, frankly, when funding for our state is limited. We'll be working in coalition to advocate for the funding needed to stabilize this work in community so that everyone has a place to turn to in a time of need. With that, I want to turn it over to the amazing district attorney from Clackamas County. He's laughing when I said amazing. I actually do think he's amazing. John Wentworth.
Thank you, Attorney General Rayfield. Good afternoon. My name is John Wentworth. I'm the Clackamas County District Attorney. I'm also the president of the Oregon District Attorneys Association. And I'm not one who normally engages in hyperbole, so I want you to hear what I have to say. This is a fact. We're standing on the edge of a catastrophic failure of our duty to protect the most vulnerable people in our communities, victims of crime. A federally created funding crisis has landed on our doorstep, and if we don't act, the people we represent will pay the price. The Federal Victims of Crime Act Fund, or VOCA, as it's commonly called, has been the primary funding source for nearly 150 victim service providers across Oregon for decades. This is the money that keeps the lights on at domestic violence shelters. It pays for the specially trained advocates at children's advocacy centers who provide a safe space for abused children to describe the unspeakable. It funds the court advocates who guide terrified victims through a confusing and intimidating justice system. I'd like you to consider the plight of a mother who finally finds the courage to pack a bag, grab her children, and flee an abusive home in the middle of the night. Where will she go? VOCA funding is a lifeline that pays for crucial services for her and thousands of others. It is the warm, reassuring voice on the other end of a crisis line. It's the domestic violence service that provides a safety plan and a bed and a shelter. It's the victim advocate who helps her file a restraining order so she can finally start a new, safe life. When we cut this funding, we're cutting her lifeline. We're sending her and her children back into the dark, back into danger. Now that funding is being eliminated, ripping an enormous hole in Oregon's public safety net. This isn't an abstract budget problem. This is a human crisis. In my own office, I face cutting more than half of my victim advocates. These are the dedicated professionals who ensure a victim's voice is heard in the court and that their rights are protected. All over the state, organizations like Clackamas Women's Services have already reduced staff and cut essential programs for crime victims. Let me be clear about what that means. When you cut victim services, you are choosing to have more crime. A victim without support is a victim who cannot testify. A survivor without a place to go is a survivor who is forced to return to her abuser. When victims cannot participate in the justice process, cases fall apart. Violent offenders remain on our streets and the cycle of violence accelerates, and we all become less safe. Justice has never been just about convicting the guilty. It's equally about supporting the innocent. This crisis was not of Oregon's making, but the solution has to be. And multiple avenues to that solution, like the one being proposed by Attorney General Rayfield, have to be pursued. Funding victim services is a moral imperative. For 40 years, we have made a promise to crime victims. You are not alone. We will help you. We can't let 2025 be the year that Oregon breaks that promise. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Attorney General Rayfield, for this opportunity. My name is Melissa Earlbaum, and I'm the Executive Director of Clackamas Women's Services and a member program of the Alliance to End Gender-Based Violence. Over 25 years, I've worked in the field of victim services. We have made incredible progress, and it breaks my heart today to experience the destruction of our system of safety and care. Child abuse centers, domestic and sexual violence programs, and DA's offices come together to form an essential safety net that serves victims in every corner of Oregon, from rural towns to coastal communities to urban neighborhoods and frontier regions. Here in Clackamas, we have laid off staff and we've already reduced services due to the 40% cuts in life-saving VOCA funding. And now, because we're unable to even access the reduced amount of VOCA funding, programs are forced to implement emergency pauses or close services entirely. Every day, CWS, with our partners at Safe Place Family Justice Center, welcome victims and their children who walk through our doors. They don't need an appointment. They don't need to know the right words to say. They need to come in and they'll be met with a confidential advocate. Survivors can create a safety plan, learn how to file a police report, get a restraining order, or be connected to emergency shelter. Now imagine this. Imagine living with harm, violence, and abuse, gathering your children and leaving the only home you know, stepping into the unknown with little resources and support, and no idea where to turn. And we know that leaving is the most lethal and dangerous time. That's why when someone walks through our doors, we make sure they are met with compassion, resources, and hope. But today, we face the reality of future reductions. That means turning people away. That means delaying safety, and every delay can mean danger, it will erode trust, and it will cost lives. Survivors test the waters when they come to us, asking silently, "Can I trust you? Will you be here if I take this risk?" And if they reach out to us and find nothing, then what happens? This is not just about services, it's about life or death. It's about thriving communities. It's about whether a survivor and their children find safety or stays trapped and violence because help wasn't there. That's what's at stake. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jenny Gilmore Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of CARES Northwest, the oldest and largest children's advocacy center in Oregon. And I'd like to first thank you all for coming and thank the Attorney General and all of our distinguished leaders for their support. CARES Northwest is a very special pediatric clinic that provides care for children at the center of child abuse investigations. We provide child abuse evaluation, trauma therapy, family support services for over 1,300 children each year from Multnomah and Washington counties. Now, Federal Victims of Crime Act funding has been a cornerstone of victim services in Oregon for decades. The sudden and unexpected cut of 80% or more of this funding is devastating. For CARES Northwest, it will amount to almost $600,000 per year. And I don't know how we are going to replace that financial support. We are at the perfect storm of funding catastrophe, loss of federal funding, increased competition for private grants, financial uncertainty among donors. And as a healthcare clinic with 75% of our pediatric patients on Oregon Health Plan, we're also potentially facing cuts to Medicaid. And this funding, this VOCA funding, takes away from patient care, from services for children who have been through a nightmare, and they deserve the chance to be safe and to heal. At CARES Northwest, VOCA funds child interviewers who talk with kids in the right way about what happened to them without traumatizing them or putting words in their mouths. Family support team members who meet parents and caregivers where they are when their world has turned upside down because someone has hurt their child. And emergency support services like food and transportation assistance. Now, at many children's advocacy centers, including CARES Northwest, these funding cuts are going to force children and their families to wait for services at a time when help must not be delayed. We know what it's like to tell a terrified parent that their child will need to wait weeks for a child abuse evaluation appointment or months to start trauma counseling to begin to heal. It's what drives us every single day to try to do more with less, and it is impossible. These cuts will impact victim services organizations across the state that serve survivors of every single type of violence you can imagine: child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking. And I am so grateful to the Attorney General and our district attorneys and our community partners for their attention to this matter, because your advocacy is critical. These services and these funds are critical. We must find a way forward. We must find a way forward to keep these services whole and accessible, whether that's through federal dollars or state level funding, because this is not just a funding issue. This is about whether Oregon can meet its legal and moral responsibility to protect its most vulnerable residents. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Barton. I'm the Washington County District Attorney, and I want to thank again Attorney General Rayfield for convening this important conversation about the issue in front of us. It's been said that the true measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. The loss of VOCA funding harms the most vulnerable members of our society who are victims of crime, and it harms the most vulnerable victims: children, those fleeing domestic violence, and those impacted by sexual assault. It harms them in a uniquely cruel way. When I think of this issue, I don't think of the theoretical, I think of the actual. I think of the hundreds or thousands of victims that come into my office lobby every year and come into office lobbies around the state to seek services from a district attorney, from a police department, from a nonprofit provider. I think in particular about the victims I've personally interacted with over the years. A young girl who was 5 years old forced to testify in court about what her father had done to her, so afraid she couldn't even say her name when she had to take her oath. And it was a victim advocate and support from CARES Northwest that gave her the strength to be able to move forward and talk about what had happened to her so that a prosecutor like me could seek justice in court and ultimately protect her and her family and our community. These cuts harm victims, they harm our community, and they harm them in a particular way by taking funds away from district attorney victim assistance programs that fund things like victim advocates who accompany victims to court, who ensure that victims' statutory and constitutional rights are honored, who help victims seek restitution, and most importantly, help restore a sense of safety for crime victims and survivors. In my office, we'll lose about a quarter of our staff providing these essential services. It harms the nonprofits that we partner with that help create this safety net that we have in Oregon for crime victims. Nonprofits, not just like CARES and Clackamas County Children and Women's Services, but nonprofits across the state. Nonprofits like the Sexual Assault Resource Center, SARC, who did announce last week that they are stopping all of their services in light of these funding cuts. That cannot be. I commend Attorney General Rayfield for taking these steps to pursue restoration of these funds, and I also call upon the legislature to act. It is imperative that the legislature acts without delay to ensure that we have sufficient emergency funding to backfill these losses. Without immediate action, I am very concerned irreparable harm will occur and victims across Oregon will not receive the services they deserve. Some might say that Oregon cannot afford to backfill these federal funds, but I say we cannot afford not to. The true measure of Oregonians must be to ensure that we do not turn our back on the most vulnerable members of our community, crime victims. Thank you.
Again, I want to thank our leaders for being here today, and just want to point out again, as you just heard, these aren't just numbers on a page. This isn't just $18 million that we're not receiving as a state. These are families, these are children, these are individuals in our communities whose safety depends upon all of these services. We know that the federal government's chaos has only made it harder at the state level, and we have an obligation to ask the legislature to step in and backfill what's been cut. We realize it's an incredibly challenging time to be asking state lawmakers for funding, especially because of the chaos caused by the federal government. But the people who rely on these services, like those provided here at the Family Justice Center, absolutely cannot wait. With that, we're happy to take questions as we move through. And again, I'd invite everyone up here as well. I may not have all of the answers that you're looking for. So, yeah, please, in the back. So this is the Victims of Crime Act. So what you'll hear is say VOCA funding that is being cut. And this is something in Oregon that we've traditionally funded victims of crime services, a whole host of services, child advocacy centers, that this funding trickles down into communities across the state. In fact, it's impacting rural communities disproportionately as the way it's happening, impacting the metro areas. And so that is the funding that is being impacted. The federal government right now is adding unlawful or illegal terms and conditions to contracts, asking the state to sign those. And the terms and conditions that are unlawful are things that would violate judicial precedent and would violate our Oregon sanctuary status laws. And so they're putting us and using this Victims of Crime advocate as leverage to try and compel action in unlawful ways. And that is what the lawsuit is about, is to stop the federal government from doing this. The history and pattern of this is not new, and I mentioned federal judicial precedent. During the first Trump administration, there was a similar lawsuit that was filed, and this was on burn JAG grants and other public safety money that comes into all of our communities. This is the first time that they've ever tried to leverage victims of crime, so to be very clear there. But in that case, went forward very quickly, and in the Oregon Federal Circuit, we got a ruling very quickly that the federal government was not allowed to put similar terms and conditions on funding like this. The reason why is that Congress has allocated this money under a certain formula. And when Congress allocates money, the federal government or the executive branch must follow Congress's will. And by putting additional terms and conditions that were not authorized by Congress, they are in violation of the congressional intent and the formula funding. And that's why we were successful in the first round.
Talked about a 40% reduction prior to this,
So, and I want to make sure that I'm answering the question and make sure I'm understanding you. So there's what I consider two different separate issues. One is, how are we going to fund victims of crime here in Oregon just long term? And that is a partnership between the federal government and the state. Historically, what has happened, and this is irrespective of the lawsuit right now, you have seen the federal funding, and again, this is criminal fines coming in, has decreased over time. Throughout the years, even when I was in the legislature, the state of Oregon stepped up to backfill that decreased federal funding that wasn't coming in. And so that is one set of issues that we in Oregon have to look around, and the legislature has to make a decision. How do we want to fund when victims of crime services when the federal money is continuing to dry up or dwindle? And that's a priority. That is one conversation. The second conversation right now is just the regular funding that does come in from VOCA grants. And that's what we're talking about here today, is that funding has had the illegal terms and conditions that have been put on it, and that is what we're fighting in federal court. Please.
you talked about asking the legislature to step up. What is the ask here? We're talking about potentially $15 million that the state now might not have access to. What is the ask?
Yeah, and so to put a finer point on that, there's $18 million that otherwise would come into the state of Oregon that is not coming in. Of that money, 15 goes directly to services that, as you heard about, impact Oregonians across the state. $3 million of that goes to for victims of crime compensation in communities. And so that would be the ask moving forward. I think it's incredibly important to note, and I think one of the speakers talked about this, it's the complexities of being hit in all different areas that is making being in the legislature and making decisions on funding right now incredibly challenging. The state is not set up to backfill the loss of all of the federal funds that are coming into the state. Right now, the state is engaged in 37 lawsuits impacting roughly about $3.3 billion of money coming into the state. The state of Oregon, Oregonians as residents do not have the tax base to support or backfill that. However, as you heard today, all of us are standing together in coalition to ask the legislature, this is something we need to do moving forward.
Have you heard from state lawmakers or the governor?
We have not.
A quick question unrelated to this. President Trump is talking about banning mail-in voting. Do you have thoughts on that?
The one thing about mail-in voting here in this state is we have always been a leader in terms of access for voters. If you look at the history of our Secretary of States that have served, even Republican Dennis Richardson talked about the values about mail-in voting. This is a new political avenue that is strange to be taking right now, especially when it's been proven to increase access, as well as Oregon having some of the most stable and effective elections in the country.
Can you be a little bit more clear when you are asking what you are asking the legislature for? Are you calling for a special session? Are you calling for them to fill the gap for this thing that the law seems to may or may not resolve? Or are you just calling for them to increase overall funding that's declining?
So some funding will go out to all the services between now and the short session. We are going to be calling on the legislature to backfill the funding, the $18 million, during this period of time. So hopefully giving services the ability to operate as long as they possibly can without reducing services. Obviously, you're hearing right now that that is not an option for some. However, we will then be asking whether it is in an emergency board setting or whether it is when they come into a short session, that this is a consideration that legislators at least evaluate before going home.
What happens if it ends up getting resolved with the lawsuit and they've already incurred that money?
So under those circumstances, we could put in different types of things where we could fund that money back to the state. There's different ways that the legislature could structure that, and we are looking forward to being in partnership with them if they choose to go down that avenue. Please.
There's a theme of threatening to withhold funds if Oregon and other blue states don't abide by the Trump administration's immigration plan, including this lawsuit. How many other lawsuits fit into that theme that you think from other states?
There's a handful. So we have a handful of what we call terms and conditions lawsuits where the Trump administration is trying to put these unlawful or illegal terms and conditions on funding streams, whether that's transportation or whether that's today victims of crime. And again, this is a pattern of this administration to try and leverage people, individuals in community to achieve a policy aim. And right now you have the Trump administration that doesn't like our state laws. A state law that I might add was passed nearly unanimously in 1987. There was only one no vote in the Senate and only one no vote in the House. It was incredibly bipartisan. So this is a new thing where they're trying to leverage groups and communities to achieve a policy aim. Now the reality with that is it is in complete odds with federal judicial precedent here in this state, and it's at odds with our state law. And effectively, they're asking us to ignore federal precedent to sign these contracts and asking us to break state laws that have been proven to be constitutional, and we just can't do that. Please.
Any idea how many organizations are at risk? Could you provide a little bit of a breakdown of how that $18 million is distributed?
We can get you the details on how all of the VOCA funding is distributed, but there's around 147 different super providers that are going to be impacted here in Oregon.
Any idea how many of them are not able to continue?
I don't have specific numbers on that. We can get back to you with those numbers. And I don't know if you all have specific numbers.
You could certainly say every DA's office.
Yeah, and maybe do you want to speak to the DA's office?
Yeah, the answer of the 147, we don't have a specific number yet. I can tell you that every DA's office in this state is impacted by the lack of VOCA funding. We all rely on those that funding to make sure that we have victim advocates who can help victims through the criminal justice system. The challenge is, in Clackamas County, we're well resourced, and even though I'm losing half my staff, there are DA's offices around this state that are losing their entire staff, and we as prosecutors don't have the skill to do what our victim advocates do, and that's to help crime victims in their most traumatic moment. So that's going to be a real challenge for us.
When people hear $18 million for the entire state, it doesn't sound like that much money. I mean, it's a large sum, but for all of these services across the state, can you have an idea of how much is actually, that is at stake here? Are there other grant sources that are funding these, and what percentage of it?
You want to take that or you want?
And again, I think what you got to think about in a rural community, one of the things that I learned in the legislature is that $200,000 to the Portland metropolitan area is very different to rural communities in Oregon. So the $18 million goes a really long way in community. The type of services, as you heard, are the type of services that are, and I think in one of them we're helping 1,300 families and kids. So if you think about what our organizations are able to provide, it's pretty impressive. And we can get more specific numbers on exactly what you're looking for, and Jenny in our office can get that to you a little bit later today.
I have a question for CWS or CARES Northwest. Either can respond, but what's your message to survivors of crime, to victims who are maybe going to see this and feel nervous about what things look like moving forward?
Thank you for that question. That's the thing that keeps me up every night. We are going to stay open. We just may not have as many resources as we had before, but we will make sure that there's somebody answering that call and providing as much support as we possibly can. We know how dangerous it is when someone is trying to leave. And, to the earlier question, I know that of the 60 plus organizations, community-based and tribal communities across the state, this will cause reductions in every single one of those programs. And those of us that are a little bit larger, we will try to stay open to answer those 24-hour calls and do it the best that we can. We don't want people to stop calling us, and our options may be reduced slightly.
the service providers as well. Could you give an idea of how much percentage of funding is federal for you?
At Clackamas Women's Services, about 80% of about 40% of our funding is federal. About 80% of it's government, 40% is federal. And as the Attorney General mentioned, across the state that varies. So we have some domestic and sexual violence programs that 80 to 100% is federally funded. So when there's a cut like this, it completely decimates their ability to provide services.
Would it be accurate to say it affects rural more than?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we had already gone through, because of reductions in VOCA and other state and federal funding, we had reduced staff by 23%. That's 17 positions at Clackamas Women's Services, mostly impacting our youth services and our ability to serve survivors walking in the Family Justice Center.
And I'm losing track a little bit of the questions, but I wanted to echo what Melissa was saying as far as what we would tell our child abuse survivors, these incredibly brave children and youth, that if you can be brave enough to come forward, we will be there. We will be there to meet you where you are and to support you through this process. It may take longer. I think we can expect families to experience delays, but we will do our absolute best. Every case is important, and some are more time sensitive than others. We will get those cases in, and we will be there for these families. With regards to the question about how this is impacting children's advocacy centers, as Melissa said, with regards to our domestic violence and sexual assault organizations, it's the same with child abuse centers, in that every single one of us is going to be impacted by this, which means every single one of our communities and the children and families that we serve. At this point, I'm aware that at least 75% of all children's advocacy centers around the state are either have already begun to lay off or furlough staff or have plans to do so. I think the question also was what percentage does this represent? It's going to vary from Children's Advocacy Center to Children's Advocacy Center. For CARES Northwest, for example, we are the oldest and the largest, and we're quite fortunate, and it's taken quite a great deal of work for us to have a diverse source of revenue streams. And so Victims of Crime Act funding is 8% of our budget. Now that's still a real challenge to overcome. But for some of our smaller organizations, whether they are in more rural or frontier communities, or even those that are closer to metro areas, if that represents the majority of your funding, this means closing your doors, and that can't happen.
What is the exact quid pro quo that is for the AG that is brought into question with the changes in the contract? What is it that they're asking for specifically in exchange for this funding?
Yeah, and this is a very common thing that is going on right now, where the Trump administration is trying to use and implement terminology that would require the state to violate federal precedent, comply, for instance, and give you a good example, violate our state laws or sanctuary status laws, where one could be even compelled to talk about anonymous homes where victims are being taken care of. So it's services that are really provided upon anonymity, and some of these spaces violate some of those tenets and how that could be done. But you're seeing this not just here with victims of crime. You're seeing these terms and conditions applied broadly, which is why you have all the attorneys general in the Democratic space across the country banding together to file this lawsuit. And again, we've been successful in the past in similar lawsuits, and I expect us to be successful again. Here in the United States, we do not leverage victims of crime or other vulnerable communities to meet a political end. That just isn't something we do. When we have disagreements about policy or state law, there are ways to do that in court that doesn't impact or threaten the vital services that we provide to Oregonians. So this is incredibly unconscionable at this point in time. But it's also, like I said, these lawsuits are incredibly reactionary, right? We are reacting to something that the federal government is doing, trying to protect the essential services, which is why the essential component to this strategy also involves having the legislature work with us to make sure that this funding can continue while we are litigating this in court.
Just to kind of turn that into layman terms and make sure I understand what you're saying.
That's what my son tells me all the time.
The wording would call on you to potentially release some undocumented immigrants that you're providing services to and their information to the federal government. Is that
No, it would require us to violate the sanctuary status law by signing these terms and conditions.
So potentially disclose information through Oregon State Police, like what are the...
Yeah, the terms are vague enough to where the way that they're trying to open the door could disclose a lot of anonymous and protected information in violation of our state law and frankly in violation of prior judicial precedent. Yes.
Along that note, it's my understanding that Governor until tomorrow to respond to U.S. Attorney General talking about like a clear threat to end Oregon's sanctuary law, or for Oregon to stop complying with its sanctuary laws. Are you talking to the governor about what your response will be? What's exactly that? Is that going to be in the process?
So you would like me to disclose publicly in front of everyone what the governor and I are discussing as a response? I'm just playing with you. I'm totally playing. No, unfortunately, I'm not able to comment on that right now. Yeah, I'm just teasing. So, all right. Any other questions? And again, I think today should really be focused about the services that we're providing in community and the impact in the ground. So thank you for being here today. And again, thank you incredibly to our leaders and to the work that they do in community.
Oh my goodness. Not everyone agrees. Yeah, I know, right?